So Manchester City have reached a settlement with the Premier League in a challenge over sponsorship rules specifically related to associated party transactions. And what happened here was Manchester City were trying to do commercial deals with associated parties, most notably Etihad. They felt like the associated party transaction rules were standing in their way. They made a legal challenge, and the Premier League were forced to make amendments to the rules, particularly related to so-called shareholder loans, which were not factored in. But the irony of that is these shareholder loans were common practices at clubs like Arsenal and Brighton, and not Manchester City. The Premier League then felt that their overall structure and rules were valid, so they made small and hastily amended changes, and City challenged again. But now the parties have decided to settle, and as part of that settlement, Manchester City have decided that the current amendments to associated party transaction rules are valid and are binding. So that's a win for the Premier League. But at the same time, City now expect to formalise a deal with Etihad that will be for their shirt sponsorship and their stadium naming rights that will be far more lucrative than the last agreement, which was back in 2011. And previous versions of that deal and other Abu Dhabi-based third-party sponsorship were blocked by the Premier League and now are not expected to be. So City have got a lucrative deal, which will help their books. The Premier League have got a win because their rules are seen as valid, and both sides have saved on time and legal costs. I think other Premier League clubs will have a mixed reaction. We know that Newcastle United had big support for Manchester City and their position. And remember, the associated party transaction rules in their current form were born off the back of the Newcastle United takeover to make sure that PIF effectively couldn't come in with a massive financial flex. The irony of all of this is that Manchester City's problem with the associated party transaction rules related to shareholder loans and how they were not factored in. And this is a practice undertaken by, say, Arsenal and Brighton, but not actually Manchester City. And as a consequence, it was always a little bit strange in some ways that City was so fiercely against the old associated party transaction rules before the amendments, when much of their points of grievances didn't relate directly to the club. So now I think you're going to get two things. The first is other clubs looking at the current rules and amendments, seeing how Manchester City are able to get deals done and following that precedent. So that's good news for Chelsea in a multi-club model, and obviously Newcastle United and any other club moving in that direction over time. And then I think you're going to get some of the Premier League clubs that maybe feel they're smaller, financially speaking only, that feel if these associated party transaction rules are to allow Manchester City to do billion-dollar deals, such as with Etihad, we need to move away from PSR. Now, PSR this summer hasn't been a huge problem, and maybe it's a myth that has actually been the stumbling block for many in the market. Last year, it felt like it was all about PSR, but now really it's clubs navigating the UEFA rules, and many clubs have got the PSR headroom to spend well over 100 million this summer. But I sense that clubs issue if PSR maintains. If, for example, you're a Sunderland or a Burnley or a Leeds, the three newly promoted sides, they will argue the challenge is that PSR benefits the clubs with massive revenue because they can spend. Now, if we allow third-party transactions done at fair market value still to give a boost to income at clubs like Manchester City, but PSR is replaced with something more similar to UEFA's squad cost control measure, but it's anchored. So without going into too much micro detail, there's a cap. Then that means that you can earn what you like, but you can't spend what you like. And that will allow parity and the smaller clubs in the market to still stand a chance. So I don't think there'll be many that are against the current associated party transaction rules, because remember, it was originally Man City that were challenging them, and the vast majority of the Premier League clubs wave through the amendments to the rules in their current form. But now Manchester City are able to do a big deal of the magnitude of this Etihad one. I think you'll get a lot of, again, only financially speaking, the smaller clubs in the Premier League saying, hang on a minute, we need to make sure that these new rules that are being shadowed at the moment come into force, because that way there'll be a cap. And therefore, those that do giant deals won't just be able to have unlimited spend on transfers and wages and agent fees without the cap. I think that's when certain Premier League clubs will say there's a massive gulf between what they can do and spend and what clubs like Manchester City are able to do. So there's no direct bearing on the 115 or 130 charges, and the verdict for that is expected before the year is out. It might even only be a matter of weeks. But obviously what this shows is that there's maybe a thawing of relations between Manchester City and the Premier League. And if they can get in a room and settle APT, then could they get in a room and settle these charges in a way that's palatable to both the Premier League and Manchester City? We'll have to wait and see. One settlement doesn't automatically mean another. But what's clear is that the Premier League and Manchester City with APT wanted to work together amicably to save time and legal costs and find a mutual way of resolving this, because the other option was either Man City would have won and then the Premier League would have had to rewrite their APT rulebook, or the Premier League would have won and then from Manchester City's point of view, they would have wasted a lot of time and effort and energy when actually maybe their focus is on trying to get clarity for this bigger case and these 115 to 130 charges. So I think the next step in all of this is to understand that there probably will be an element of settlement in the bigger case, because it's so vast that Manchester City and the Premier League will find areas of victory and defeat in whatever the ruling is. And I think both the Premier League and Manchester City will be wary of getting into a long-winded and costly cycle of appeal and counter-appeal. So I think there is a fair chance that the legal teams are already speaking and digesting the verdict. We shouldn't assume there'll be a settlement, but what is obvious is that they have, in the past, worked together to find a resolution. And it's so complicated when the ruling comes out. It won't just be a case of here's the punishment, it's accepted, or completely not guilty and again accepted. So I think this sets a precedent to show the two legal teams might be able to work together. And the reality is that the longer this bigger case goes on, the more the entire football community are in the dark. City are in limbo waiting to see what the verdict is and if there's a punishment. The Premier League are putting in a lot of resource and a lot of legal power and a lot of cost, which is all ultimately paid for by the clubs. And at the end of the day, I think everyone wants clearly fairness and a ruling made by an independent panel. But I think both the Premier League and Manchester City and the wider football community also want to draw a line under this and move it on, because the longer it drags on, the more it looks like this whole process has taken too much time. And the more you think, with a new independent football regulator incoming, and with the Premier League self-regulating, with both parties using an independent panel, and with not much transparency at the moment as to where we're at and what the next steps might be, it's been messy. And the advantage of a settlement in the case of APT is that you can draw a clean line under it. And now we have to wait and see whether anything similar happens with the bigger case. And if not, then there is a danger that whatever the ruling is when it comes out between now and the end of the year, there's a next step and a next step and a next step. And at the end of the day, I think all parties will want to try and avoid that if at all possible.